Hey all, Neo from the Overclocker. So last week we spoke about a Kingbank DDR5 6000 CL28 kit. Well, you guessed it, I'm here again talking about yet another DDR5 6000 CL28 kit. But this time there are a few differences, mainly because this one is from Exceleram, and if you've not heard of the brand, well, you're not alone. I myself had not heard of the brand until a few months ago, and even then, information about this brand and their products isn't easy to come by. What that means as well is that buying this memory can prove to be a bit tricky, as most common retail outlets I'm aware of do not have this memory, and those that do don't have a price. I do have info, however, that says this memory should be about $156 excluding VAT, whatever that is, wherever you are. So this series of memory is called Aurum, at least that's how I think it's pronounced. It's clearly meant to be cost effective, but with some semblance of style, hence the rather particular DRAM styling that's reminiscent of the DDR3 days. That said, someone somewhere out there is going to find this attractive, so I'm just going to leave it at that. The heat sinks are thin, and as such, I was not expecting much in terms of thermal tolerance. However, I was pleasantly surprised by how cool the DRAM stayed, even under stressful loads. I didn't try voltages above 1.5 volts, but I did record temps below 50 degrees on the memory after hours of RAM test and just 56 degrees from the SPD IC software reading. Exceleram seems to have used some decent ICs on this memory, as the default operating specification is CL28 3636 96 at 1.4 volts, and with an Expo and an XMP profile as well. This memory has better ICs than the Kingbank set, if only because it needed 50 millivolts less for the same frequency and cache latency according to the XMP profile. You'll see this on the OC results as well, where I was able to get up to DDR5 8600 as opposed to 8400 on the previous set, which is about in line with what one would expect from a slightly better bin of these ICs. It is because of this easy OC headroom that this kit, depending on the price of course, is totally worth it. Even better yet, if you're on the AMD platform, you can just run CL28 6400 at 1.4 volts, which is pretty good, especially with tuned subtimings. Since we're talking about performance, we may as well get to the benchmark so you can see how this additional headroom affects the system. Testing was done on the Intel Core Ultra 265K, on the ROG Maximus Z890 Apex, the ROG Strix GeForce RTX 4080, powered by the Corsair HX1500i ATX 3.1 PSU, and cooled by the Corsair Titan RX 360mm AIO. As always, we have either 64 memory bandwidth first. You know what this should look like by now, roughly 40 gigabytes a second more with overclocking to 8600. 6000 has more bandwidth than 6400 here because on the Apex, using XMP tweaked, which is what I used, raises the NGU and die-to-die ratio to 32, similar to what Intel's 200S boost does without the DRAM frequency adjustment to 8000 of course. Latency is obviously much better as well here, as we can see a combination of XMP timings and the NGU ratio increase performance. Geekbench 6 shows modest gains from XMP. Where you do see something meaningful is between 6400 and 8600. Buying a DDR5 6000 kit for the Z890 platform for me implies that you are, to some degree at least, aware that Intel has 6400 as a supported spec. So overclocking outside of XMP is something you are likely going to do anyway. And if that's the case, you may as well do 8600 on a supporting motherboard. And fortunately, most mid to high-end boards these days have 8600 profiles and such. In Geekbench AI, we see similar behavior. If whatever workload you have is represented by this benchmark, I'd say in this case, overclocking isn't worth it and something else will have to compare you about this Aurum kit. SuperPi 32M benefits immensely from overclocking, and in fact, with these results, they are actually bugged low. This should be in the 320s for the 8600 setting. The 7-zip benchmark shows an 8K difference between 6400 and XMP, and a further 10K more between that setting and 8600. Equally so, Y-Cruncher shows some meaningful reductions in compute time for the overclock settings versus XMP. In the V-Ray 6 CPU benchmark, the overclock settings offer 1000 points more than XMP, down to just the bandwidth advantage of course, as the NGU ratio is the same between the two. We then come to the first gaming test in Hitman World of Assassination, and again we see a sizable difference between 8600 and 6400 to the tune of 25 frames per second on average. XMP does make a difference, but it's small of course. Forza Horizon 5 shows the advantage of XMP and rather the D2D and NGU ratio adjustment over 6400, with the uplift thereafter being much smaller. Dragon Age shows relatively small gains, just 4 FPS between the slowest and the fastest settings, and 7 FPS in the 1% lows. Another one where overclocking isn't worth it with this level of GPU or settings. Finally, we have Marvel Spider-Man 2, where the differences, at least in average frame rates, are rather large by way of XMP or manual overclocking. In both cases, the uptick is 10 FPS respectively. Definitely worth it here as things stand. Alright then, with the numbers out the way, it should be easy to see how capable this memory is. While these numbers are normal for this kind of IC, there's some performance to be gained here obviously from tuning the subtimings, and if you are willing to increase the operating voltage to 1.45 volts as I did, or even 1.5 volts. I wasn't willing to do this of course, but I'm sure with the fan this shouldn't be an issue. When it comes to the looks, again, I'm not going to say much here as there's an entire value proposition here that's outside of just the visual aspect. With DDR5 prices rising, I always welcome new players into the market that are able to offer cost-effective options for the growing number of PC gamers out there who are working on a tighter budget. At the right price, this could be some great memory. Anyway, I've been Neo, and this has been my first experience with the Exceleram and the Aurum DDR5 memory. In as far as first impressions go, this has been pretty good, I have to admit. All we can do now is see if they can produce and bring this to market in volume and with wide availability. Until the next time, please do take great care of yourselves, and I'll see you on the flip side. Peace.